What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Outward's Definitive Edition. Now, I do want to mention right here at the beginning of the video that I did previously do a sponsored video for Outward Definitive Edition's launch, where I talked about some of these specific changes, etc. But of course, an actual review would never be sponsored, but nonetheless, there's that disclosure for you. And to get the regular stuff out of the way, I review games after 100% all the time, specifically to set me apart from other YouTubers. It does, of course, include the achievements, but also includes a great deal of other stuff as well. If you're not subscribed to the channel and you click on the channel page, first video you'll see is a video explaining everything and all the things that I cover. But with no further ado, let's actually jump into this thing. So the first thing to understand about Outward is that honestly, it's not a game for everyone. It tends to be very polarizing in that regard, and we're going to talk about all of that, obviously. But primarily, the game is a survival game first. It's more of a AA production from 9 Dot Studios out of Canada, so naturally there's a bit of jankiness to it. While it does have a lot of RPG elements, and there is of course a story involved, the game itself is first and foremost a survival game. Now, you can play through the entire game in co-op, so if anything I'm about to mention is giving you a lot of trouble, do keep in mind that if you have someone who also owns this game, you can just jump in and play together. In fact, there's even split-screen co-op if you don't want to buy the game twice. While the story certainly isn't the focus of the title, I will nonetheless give a bit of a plot setup here that will largely be as free of spoilers as I can make it. But the general setup is that you are someone who owes what is called a blood price. This is essentially a punishment that is laid on a family's entire generational span until it is paid. This is primarily done by a faction known as the Blue Chamber Collective. They value survival and the group as a whole rather than the individual, which is why they have this blood price punishment in place, which, as you might imagine, is a bit of a polarizing thing to do in and of itself. In addition to the Blue Chamber Collective, there are other factions who do things and feel differently about the blood price, but you, as a character, have that blood price on you. It's a focus of a lot of the factions, so I mention it here. 2 of the factions are at war, and then there's also the Scourge. Scourge are a bit of mindless beasts that attack more or less anyone, really. And their appearance has caused this formation of civilization, as a lot of what people do is try to avoid and combat the Scourge. But more than anything, everyone's just kind of surviving, which is why things are so hard in the world. The story itself revolves around dealing with the Scourge as well as some of the inter-faction fighting. And we'll talk more about those factions a little later in the video, but that's the general setup. Now, in terms of character creation, it is pretty basic. Understand that each character only gets 1 save, so you will have to live with your decisions in that regard. But character creation is primarily cosmetic, and it's AA, so it's not exactly fancy cosmetic either. There's just a handful of options. But probably the most important thing to understand about character creation is the legacy system. As you play the game with one character, you can find up to 4 legacy chests that you can put items in. And when you start a new character, any character whose legacy you pick will then have the items that are in those chests on that character's save file, then transferred into the new character's save games. So in this way, you can pass down items that will make your subsequent playthroughs a little easier. And a lot of items, when you are doing this, actually upgrade to better versions of the armor or item as well, which is pretty cool. Now, let's talk character progression a little bit. Now, this primarily comes down to skills and gear. As you traverse the world and, you're out there surviving, you'll of course come across better gear, which is pretty straightforward. Some of it is very specialized to the type of combat you'd like to engage in. For instance, if you're playing a magic user, you want to kind of go after mana reduction, whereas other builds might prioritize movement speed or protection or damage reduction. So there is a little bit of variance to the gear, but honestly, once you know what you want to do, there is pretty much a best option in most cases. Now, the other part of it is skills. This is where things get interesting because there are very few skills in Outward in any combat style that are super effective on their own. A lot of the skill system revolves around building skills off of each other. A lot of your direct damage skills, for instance, even in just regular melee combat, require you to have certain boons active or buffs. which are separate skills. So you use the buff or you do an action that causes you to gain the buff, and then you use the associated damage skill. Now this basically stays consistent across all of the combat. There's a handful of skills that don't work like this, but by and large, that's how it happens. And then there are a lot of passive skills you can earn as well. Now, where you actually get these skills from is trainers. Throughout the game, you'll find trainers that specialize in a skill tree. Now, everyone can pick up the initial skill or so and the passive of just about every single skill tree out there. However, to reach the specialized stuff, you have to spend breakthrough points on the breakthrough skill. Each character you make only gets 3 breakthrough points, so the stuff you can specialize in is limited. However, you can get a lot of the basic passives, etc. from every skill tree. Now, this system is the most interesting when it comes to magic, and that's why we're going to go ahead and talk about combat right now. Combat in this game, I would tell you, is largely to be avoided until you get to the late game. Reality is combat in almost every scenario in the early game is a waste of time and resources. Not always. Sometimes you need to kill specific enemies to get a specific item to craft something you're after as you build up your build, and then engaging in combat becomes fun later. Though I would tell you early game, until you get your character up to par, kind of where you want to be combat-wise, it is almost always recommendable to just avoid combat entirely wherever possible. Sometimes it isn't possible, but if it's optional or you could just run around, I would recommend you do so. Because a key part of combat in this survival game is the risk versus reward. And 9 out of 10, what you get from killing enemies simply is not worth the reward and the resources involved in participating in that combat, again, until you get to late game where combat becomes much more trivial. I think a really good mechanic to emphasize this with is weight and your backpack. So your backpack, which is what you're going to carry most of your inventory weight in, is something you equip. You can take it on and off. Some backpacks affect your dodge roll, in that you will dodge very slowly if you have this backpack on. In fact, getting hit in the back by enemies has a potential to do extra durability damage to your items, as items have to be repaired because of course they do, it's a survival game. But damage to your backpack might also cause items to become more damaged and require repair more often. So in most cases, you want to take a backpack off before you engage in combat. But the weight of that might cause a problem, as the weight in your backpack and the weight on your person are 2 separate things in this game. And for the most part, until the late game, that's a fairly limited space. So another question you might want to ask yourself when it comes to combat is, can you even reliably carry what you are trying to loot, for instance? Now, some backpacks actually do allow you to dodge roll without taking a penalty, and those ones are my favorite, but the carry weight on those tends to be reduced in comparison to other backpacks. Now, I say all of this to emphasize that you should get your build together before you try to engage in a lot of combat, which is why if you're trying to play this game blind, you're going to have a very bad initial experience, which we'll talk about here in a bit. Now, honestly, once you get used to where everything is, Outward's really not that big of a game, so getting your build together might take you just a few hours, really, if you kind of know where everything that you need is. So it's actually not as bad as it sounds, provided you know where everything is. But as I mentioned, combat really comes down to this skill interplay. Now, for melee and ranged, that's pretty straightforward. There is bows and more stealth options, but pretty straightforward. You use abilities that give you buffs, and then you can use or expend those buffs essentially to use other skills, which is how a lot of the late game skill system works. But broadly speaking, it's a game about kind of dodging and blocking and waiting for an opening and conserving your stamina. I have seen comparisons to Dark Souls. I would tell you it does not feel like Dark Souls to me. It lacks a lot of the weight, as a lot of the combat is very floaty, but at a bare bones level, I can understand the comparison. Now, the other thing I want to talk about when it comes to combat is my favorite part, and that is magic. Now, you do not get magic at the start of the game. What you have to do is activate your magic at a ley line. This can be done very easily if you have the Definitive Edition or the Soraborians DLC, as you can travel to a city almost immediately that just has a ley line that you can activate your magic at. The other option is going to the center of a mountain in the starting zone that will have a lot of tough enemies for the beginning of the game, which makes magic feel a little out of reach, which is a shame because it's amazing and easily my favorite part of combat. Now, magic has a very kind of ritualistic and arcane feel to it. Most of the magic in this game really boils down to it being the sum of the parts. Now, the amount of mana you have actually depends on how much life you give up when you activate your magic. So when you go to the ley line, you'll get hit with an option to sacrifice some of your life in exchange for mana. If you want to min-max, you can make do with very little mana due to the mana cost reduction options available to you, which means you can cast almost indefinitely with the right gear, so you don't need to give up that much health. But nonetheless, I like the trade-off there involved. But again, magic is more about the sum of its parts than the actual individual spells you'll be casting, as most of the magic revolves around building up to the cast. So it requires a lot of preparation. You want to apply a buff that's going to increase that type of damage. You want to hit the mana reduction. And then from there, it really depends on what type of caster you are. There is runic magic, which involves casting runes in order to produce an effect. This is one of my favorites just because it kind of leans into that ritualistic system that they have. And then there's things that were added by the DLC, like the curses, which sees you applying hexes to enemy and then using a skill to detonate those hexes. And then there's just the interplay between spells. For instance, a very common way of dealing magic is putting a sigil on the ground, which will correspond to an element in the game, and then you'll cast a spell within that sigil to then produce a greater effect, which can be absolutely devastating once you know exactly how to buff up your character and get ready for it. So much so that magic is probably my favorite way to play the game, and it is devastating on enemies towards the late game. But more than anything, combat rewards careful preparation. Now, let's move on to gameplay and world building a little bit. First thing to understand, and I mentioned this in my impressions video, is that Outward makes a rough first impression. There is a tutorial, but even still with that tutorial, there's not a lot of introduction to a lot of the mechanics, and you kind of hit just a brick wall of what you know versus what the game expects you to know, or how to deal with it. So learning some of the stuff we're about to go over can really make all the difference to enjoying this game. But I would tell you, for the first several hours I played it, I was actually hating the experience until it just kind of clicked and I got all these mechanics together. So first and foremost, as I mentioned, this is a survival game, which of course means we need to manage our needs. Things like eating, drinking, and sleeping. It's also important that you drink and eat clean food, or you can get diseases, which will then have to be cured in some way, which can take time, which affects your combat efficiency, and that can be pretty annoying. Now, the other part of this is burnt stats. So burnt stats essentially means you've been using a stat and now your character is tired. You primarily recover this by sleeping. However, there are potions, etc., that will completely trivialize this, such as endurance and life potions. And once you know how to make those, this becomes less of an issue. But the grayed out portion of your health, stamina, and mana bar is the burnt portion, meaning that you won't just recover that through normal means. You'll have to do something else. Now, you have to manage all of those needs, as well as things like your temperature, by the way, in hot and cold environments, while you traverse the world. There is a lot of walking involved in this game. I would tell you there is a small fast travel system that was added with the definitive edition that kind of helps speed this up a little bit, but it's a bit random. As in, it's not in set points. As you travel, sometimes you'll come across Soroborian caravans, and they will, for a fee, take you where you'd like to go, which will then, of course, speed up the travel. But it's kind of random when you run into them, so it's not exactly set in stone. But you will traverse 6 zones. There are 4 in the base game and 2 that were added by the DLC. To go from zone to zone, you have to go to the edge of one zone, or one of the exit points more specifically, and then have travel rations on you. These are a special type of food that is more long-lasting, meaning that it does not rot like a lot of other food does, or as fast, I should say. And these rations are used to travel in between zones. It usually costs about 3. The primary thing to get you started in Outward is understanding the basics of the survival elements. Pretty much every tree can be chopped down for wood, which can be then turned into a campfire. Campfires can be used to boil water, which will then purify your water, so you're drinking clean water. It can also be used to cook things, so you can eat. You can buy something like a tent, etc., to sleep out in the wild, and while this does come with an ambush chance, this will also give you an opportunity to repair your equipment, as well as recover burnt stats. And when you start the game, it can be a little overwhelming because, again, you're just kind of expected to do all of this immediately with very little introduction to the systems. It doesn't really ease you into it. It's just kind of, here's everything, figure it out. Now, I will tell you though, while it's kind of hard in the beginning, it swings all the way to the other end of the spectrum once you learn how to do it. As it becomes incredibly trivial, actually, once you learn all of the systems and what you need to do and what some of the recipes are for the higher end potions, because you don't need the recipes to craft things. You just have to personally know what is required to craft things. So if I know what I need to craft an endurance or a life potion, etc., then I am way better off than when I didn't know. So the more you play, the more you learn. However, I would tell you, it really takes a commitment to learning this game, to getting to that point, to a degree that I'm not sure most people are going to be up for, as a lot of what I've heard about Outward up to this point would tend to agree with. But let's say things go south for you and you get brought to 0 health. Well, this is where things get interesting. You can't actually die, really. What the game does instead is defeat scenarios. Now, this is primarily because time is a resource. What you are losing when you're brought to 0 health is not your character, etc. Again, you don't die. What you're losing is time. While there are timed quests, there are really only a couple of quests that can actually be failed. They are very few and far between. Not hitting the timer on a quest does not mean it's failed in most cases, but rather the outcome changes. You'll get a different reward or a lesser reward. But again, with all of the equipment and stuff that you can find, that's not really a big deal anyway. So I wouldn't feel pressured by the timers, but understand you'll get better rewards if you hit those timers, and the outcome of the quest will be a little different and usually more positive if you hit the timers. So when you get defeated or brought to 0 health, the thing you are losing is time. Now, depending on where you are and a few other factors, the exact defeat scenario you get can vary pretty wildly, and it will cost you anything from a couple hours to a couple days. And how quickly you, the player, can recover from this defeat also changes. Sometimes you might have your equipment, sometimes you might have to go find it. Now, it's usually marked on the compass, so it's not always a big deal, but I would tell you there are a couple instances where you can get locked in a bit of a loop, where you can't recover your equipment because it's a place that is very difficult to get to because the defeat scenario brought you there, and that can be very, very annoying. And that's usually, I would say, when most people are going to rage and quit. You can actually find some bugs and old reports, etc. about that exact thing happening, and it can be pretty frustrating. From here, let's talk about the factions a little bit. So as I've already talked about, we have the Blue Chamber Collective. They are concerned about the survival as a whole. They care less about the individual. Well, in stark contrast to them, there is the Heroic Kingdom of Levant. They are, as the story unfolds, at very high tensions with the Blue Chamber Collective. Levant does not believe in the blood price and cares more about the individual. The third faction that you can potentially join is the Holy Mission of Alat. They are much more concerned about the Scourge and promoting peace so they can combat the Scourge. They also don't like the blood price, but primarily because it gets in the way of fighting the Scourge. And then there is the fourth faction. Now, this is added by the Soroborians DLC, and if you have the definitive edition, you'll also get access to this. This is a much better faction, in my opinion, comparatively speaking, in terms of the content. Most of the 3 base game factions have very similar quests. They overlap a decent bit. You basically just see different angles of the same thing. And as I mentioned, there's only one save, so if you want to see all 4 of these storylines, you're going to have to play through the game 4 times. But I would tell you, the Soroborians are the most fun. Just because you get access to magic immediately, they are a faction that is dedicated to study and defending themselves against the Scourge. They have a lot of military might, they have a lot of magic. Their town is the most interesting even, their zone is the most interesting. They are my favorite faction for sure. Second runner-up is surprisingly the Holy Mission of Alat. That turned out to be a lot cooler than I thought it was going to be. But you'll join one of these factions and then that'll be your path through the main story. Now, again, the 3 base game factions, you're more or less going to get the same story out of it with a bit of a different flavor to each. Whereas the Soroborians is very different from the other 3, and I would highly recommend that one. Now, speaking of the DLC, let's talk about it. So, Soroborians, as I mentioned, great main faction story. They give you access to a lot of things that were more difficult to obtain in the base game. So, having that Soroborians DLC lets you access a lot more of the fun content very quickly. You can get to their zone by talking to a caravaneer in the starting town if you have the money to just travel to that zone. And then you have access to a few other things added by that DLC in particular, which are things like more build options, the curse magic, the speedster builds, which are all pretty cool and they kind of mix up the way you play. Another thing that the Sword of Boreans DLC added that I really enjoyed was the enchanting, and much like all the other magic in the game, it felt very ritualistic. The way you enchant things is like everything else with recipes. However, you have to get an enchanting table and enchanting pillars. You put down the enchanting table, and then, depending on the enchantment you want to make, you put the pillars around the enchanting table in a specific order dictated by the enchanting recipe, and then you fill those pillars with incense, put the item on the table, and then enchant it, which is a bit complicated, honestly, but you can find the recipes and it's relatively straightforward once you get the hang of it. It is not as complicated as I make it sound, I suppose, but overall, very cool. I really like the way magic was handled in this game. Now, the other DLC is called The Three Brothers. This is primarily an end-game DLC, and I would tell you most people don't wind up seeing it at all. Almost every single achievement from this DLC has less than a 1% completion rate on Steam, so it's safe to say most people don't play this. But nonetheless, The Three Brothers is primarily an in-game content area. You only get access to it once you complete the main story, so you can't even really go here before then, and you really wouldn't want to because all of the enemies here are much stronger. They tend to apply a lot of debuffs or have specific effects that can be annoying to deal with. There's a lot of challenging fights, and that's what this DLC is meant to be, a challenge. A lot of the quests are just straight up harder, more dangerous. You're dealing with a lot of mechanics from the base game, but cranked up to 11. In addition to this, it also adds a sort of city builder to the mix. You'll build up a city with various buildings, which will then give you access to various services all in one place. So you can kind of build up that city, and that's fun enough. This DLC, in my opinion, was mostly more trouble than I thought it was worth. So if you really want that extra content and you want to play Outward more and give yourself a challenge, then the Three Brothers DLC is for you, but definitely be prepared for a challenge. So from here, let's talk positives, negatives, and wrap this thing up. So positives. I like the survival mechanics once you get the hang of them because it leads to a real sense of accomplishment. You go through the difficult part, you learn all this stuff, and then you finally get the hang of the game, and it can just be a very satisfying feeling once you finally get it. Especially when you get to the point where things become so much easier because of how much you've learned. So there is that sort of rewarding experience overall when you first run through it. The other positive is, of course, the magic system. Very big fan. I love the way they handled magic. It can be a little complicated, and it's not exactly easy to get the hang of, but once you do, it's very strong. It feels very arcane and different, and I was a big fan of that. Now, the negatives were primarily a lot of the repetitious walking. I wish there was just a more straightforward fast travel system. At the end of the day, I understand it's a survival game and you're supposed to figure out the world, that kind of stuff, but here's the thing. Once you do figure out the world, running from location to location back and forth just becomes tedious. It's like, okay, well, I gotta go spend 5 minutes walking to this place because that's the only way to quickly get there, and I know I'm not going to gain anything on that journey because there's nothing from point A to point B that I know I'm going to need. It's literally just a straight run to the next place that I already have the resources for. And once you get your build together, it's like, I know I'm not even going to have the potential of finding equipment I need because I do not need anything at this point, but I still have to waste my time with this. So that can be frustrating. And then, of course, there is the very bad initial experience. The introduction to this game is rough. Now, again, there is a tutorial you can play through at the beginning of the title, and if you're committed to learning it, you will get there. But again, it doesn't change the fact that the initial gameplay experience is poor. Oftentimes it feels like the game is punishing you for making mistakes without ever telling you what you were supposed to be doing in the first place. And once you get past that, it can be a very rewarding experience, but it's just difficult to get to that point because the introduction is so rough around the edges. So, in conclusion, Outward is a very polarizing title. On one hand, it can be a lot of fun once you learn all the systems and everything, but that takes time, and you're going to lose a lot of people on the grind up to that point. But provided you're willing to put in the work, it can be very satisfying once you get there as well, and people feel very differently about that. So as a result, Outward is a very polarizing title. And overall, I would say that it is a game that does what it is trying to do quite well. And in that regard, it's a great game, and that's why it has this sort of cult classic following. But I would tell you, it just simply is not a game for everyone. But if you understand what you're getting into, then I think the fact that you can pick this up for $40 at its full price, you're getting a ton of content, probably at least 100 hours for most people if you're really trying to see all the things, then that's a great price for the title. That can eventually get to that point of satisfaction, but it simply is not a game for everyone. But if what you've seen here looks interesting, then I would absolutely recommend it. There you go, everybody. There is my review after 100% for Outward, specifically the Definitive Edition. Hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know what you feel about the title down in the comments section below. But regardless of any of that, truly just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. We're growing every day. So don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Thank you again. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.